What if I told you that some of the foods sitting in your kitchen right now could be quietly aging your brain, slowing your memory, clouding your thinking, and increasing your risk of diseases like Alzheimer's years before symptoms ever appear? Most people believe memory loss is just a normal part of getting older, but what if many of the changes we fear are being accelerated every single day by things we eat, habits we ignore, and hidden damage happening silently inside the brain? Today, we're going to uncover something that very few people truly understand. Your brain is not simply aging with time. In many cases, it is being gradually damaged by inflammation, unstable blood sugar, toxins, and even certain foods that most people assume are harmless. The good news is that once you understand the mechanisms behind brain aging, you can begin protecting your memory, focus, mental clarity, and long-term cognitive health far more effectively than most people ever imagine. To understand how food affects the brain, we first need to understand something incredibly important happening inside your body every second of the day. Your brain is protected by an extraordinary defense system called the blood-brain barrier. Think of it as a highly intelligent security shield separating your bloodstream from your brain tissue. Its job is simple but essential. Keep harmful substances out while allowing nutrients and oxygen in. When this protective barrier becomes damaged, weakened, or more permeable over time, problems begin to emerge. Harmful compounds that should never reach the brain can slowly start entering sensitive brain tissue. This creates an environment of chronic inflammation, stress, and gradual damage to neurons, the cells responsible for your thoughts, memory, attention, emotions, and ability to process information. Over the years, this damage can accumulate in ways that are almost invisible at first. Maybe you notice occasional brain fog. Maybe concentration becomes harder. You forget names more often. You feel mentally exhausted even after a full night's sleep. Most people brush these symptoms aside as normal aging, but in reality, these subtle signs may reflect changes happening deep inside the brain long before major disease appears. One of the most important things researchers and clinicians now recognize is that brain degeneration often involves chronic inflammation and disruptions in the way neurons communicate with each other. As neurons become damaged due to aging, oxidative stress, or inflammation, the signals traveling through the brain become slower and less efficient. Imagine a city where roads slowly begin deteriorating over time. Traffic still moves, but it becomes delayed, chaotic, and increasingly inefficient. That is very similar to what happens in the aging brain. In conditions like Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, abnormal plaque buildup in the brain has become one of the most recognized features. Interestingly, many specialists believe these plaques may actually be linked to immune responses in the body. Under certain circumstances, the brain releases protective compounds intended to defend against bacteria, viruses, or fungi. Normally, these compounds are cleared away, but throughout life, some of them may accumulate and gradually interfere with healthy brain function. The result? Slower communication between neurons, reduced cognitive performance, impaired memory, and progressive decline over time. But before this starts sounding frightening, I want to make something very clear. The purpose of understanding these mechanisms is not to scare you, it's to empower you. Because once you understand what damages the brain, you also begin understanding how to protect it. And one of the biggest hidden factors influencing brain health might surprise you: your blood sugar. Most people think blood sugar only matters if you have diabetes, but your brain cares deeply about how stable your glucose levels are, even if you've never had a medical diagnosis in your life. Rapid spikes and crashes in blood sugar can place enormous stress on your blood vessels, especially the tiny, delicate vessels feeding oxygen and nutrients to the brain. Your brain depends on a steady supply of blood flow. It needs oxygen. It needs stability. When blood sugar repeatedly swings up and down over many years, these blood vessels can become damaged, inflamed, and less efficient at delivering what your brain desperately needs to function at its best. Think about how you feel after eating something extremely sugary. At first, there's energy, maybe even excitement or mental stimulation. But not long after comes fatigue, brain fog, irritability, lack of motivation, and that heavy feeling where concentrating suddenly feels difficult. That short-term experience is giving you a glimpse into what unstable blood sugar can do repeatedly over time. This is why keeping blood sugar stable may be one of the simplest yet most powerful things you can do to protect your brain as you age. One practical strategy is choosing foods with a lower glycemic impact. In simple terms, these are foods that release sugar into your bloodstream more slowly and steadily rather than creating dramatic spikes and crashes. You don't need to fear carbohydrates or believe sugar itself is the enemy. Your brain absolutely needs fuel to function. In fact, despite making up only about 2% of your body weight, your brain consumes an astonishing amount of energy every single day. But the real question is not whether your brain needs glucose, it's how consistently and gently that glucose is delivered. When blood sugar rises too sharply and falls too quickly, inflammation increases, oxidative stress rises, and damage begins accumulating in ways that may not become obvious until years later. The reality is that protecting your brain isn't usually about one dramatic change. It's often about understanding small, invisible mechanisms that quietly shape your future. And now comes the part that surprises most people. Some of the foods often marketed as healthy may actually worsen inflammation, trigger immune responses, or quietly interfere with brain function in certain individuals. The first category might be one you rarely hear discussed when it comes to mental clarity, memory, and brain aging. Foods high in histamine and oxalates. In the next part, we'll uncover why certain everyday foods may trigger brain fog, headaches, poor focus, inflammation, and even mood changes without you realizing what's actually causing it. Before we talk about the foods most likely to harm your brain, there's something important you need to understand. The same food that helps one person feel energized, focused, and healthy can leave another person feeling inflamed, exhausted, mentally foggy, or emotionally drained. This is one of the biggest reasons why nutrition becomes so confusing. People often argue about what is healthy without realizing that the body's response is deeply personal. And this brings us to one of the most overlooked factors affecting cognitive health, histamine. Most people hear the word histamine and immediately think of seasonal allergies, sneezing, or skin reactions. But histamine does much more than trigger allergy symptoms. It plays a major role in inflammation, blood vessel behavior, immune signaling, and even how your nervous system functions. Inside your body are specialized immune cells called mast cells. Think of them as tiny alarm systems designed to react when your body detects something stressful or threatening, such as allergens, infections, environmental irritants, or foods that your body may not tolerate well. When these cells are activated, they release histamine. At first, histamine is not necessarily the enemy. It exists for a reason. It helps increase blood flow to areas that need immune support. It expands blood vessels, allowing immune defenses to move more efficiently. You've probably seen this happen without realizing it. For example, when someone has an allergic reaction and their skin turns red, warm, or swollen, histamine is often playing a major role behind the scenes. But problems begin when histamine levels remain elevated for too long, or when the body becomes overly reactive. When histamine becomes excessive, many people begin experiencing symptoms they never associate with food or immune reactions at all. Brain fog, persistent headaches, poor concentration, irritability, anxiety, fatigue, trouble sleeping. In some people, chronic inflammation associated with histamine imbalances may even contribute to mood changes or symptoms that resemble depression. And here's where things become especially important for brain health. Chronic inflammation affects how efficiently the nervous system functions. When the brain is exposed to prolonged inflammatory stress, attention, memory, and emotional balance can begin to suffer. So naturally, the question becomes, what increases histamine? For many people, certain foods are among the biggest triggers. One category that often surprises people is grains and dairy products. Many individuals experience increased inflammatory responses after consuming them, especially if there is an underlying sensitivity or immune reaction involved. This doesn't automatically mean these foods are harmful for everyone, but for certain people, they may quietly contribute to inflammation without obvious warning signs. Fermented foods can also play a complicated role. This is where nutrition becomes more nuanced. Foods like sauerkraut, fermented beverages, and certain probiotic-rich products are often praised for gut health, and in many cases, they absolutely can be beneficial. But for someone sensitive to histamine, these same foods may worsen symptoms instead of helping. That's why blindly following nutrition trends rarely works. Something considered a superfood for one person may actually trigger discomfort in someone else. Imagine this scenario. Someone begins eating fermented foods because they heard it improves digestion and supports healthy gut bacteria. But instead of feeling better, they experience bloating, headaches, fatigue, poor focus, or digestive discomfort. Without realizing it, they may be reacting to increased histamine rather than benefiting from the food itself. Alcohol, particularly fermented drinks like beer, may also increase histamine levels in sensitive individuals. Certain preserved foods, vinegar-based products, soy sauce, aged dairy, yogurt, and processed fermented products can sometimes become problematic as well. Nuts may also play a role, with peanuts being one of the more common examples for some people. Shellfish can trigger similar reactions in susceptible individuals, but this is incredibly important. Not everyone responds the same way. This is why paying attention to your own body matters far more than blindly copying someone else's diet online. One of the most underestimated causes of elevated histamine may surprise you even more: leftovers. Think about this for a moment. You prepare a large meal and eat it over several days. By day 2 or 3, fermentation processes naturally begin increasing even when food appears perfectly safe. For certain people, this may lead to higher histamine exposure than when the meal was originally prepared. Again, the goal here is not fear, it's awareness. You don't necessarily need to eliminate every food on a list forever. The real objective is understanding patterns. If you constantly feel bloated, mentally foggy, tired, irritable, or inflamed after eating certain foods, your body may be trying to tell you something important. And what happens when your body constantly reacts to foods? It perceives as stressful. Stress hormones rise. When your immune system becomes activated repeatedly, cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, can increase. This doesn't just affect mood. Elevated stress hormones can influence blood sugar regulation, inflammation, gut bacteria, and immune balance. Suddenly, the issue becomes much larger than digestion alone. Now we're talking about a chain reaction that may influence brain health as well. This is why some people feel dramatically better after changing their eating habits. It's not magic. In many cases, they simply reduced inflammatory triggers their body was struggling to tolerate. Fresh foods often tend to create fewer problems for people dealing with histamine sensitivity. Diet approaches emphasizing fresh proteins and minimally processed foods sometimes help reduce symptoms because they avoid many highly fermented or preserved products. If digestive inflammation is part of the picture, another important factor may involve foods that ferment heavily in the gut. Some vegetables and carbohydrates can increase digestive fermentation in sensitive individuals, contributing to discomfort and inflammation. And then there's another brain-related food factor that receives far less attention than it deserves: oxalates. Most people have never even heard the term before. Yet for some individuals, high oxalate foods may contribute to inflammation, discomfort, and systemic stress that can indirectly affect how the brain and nervous system function. When oxalates become problematic, symptoms may overlap with many other inflammatory conditions, making them difficult to recognize. Some people experience digestive irritation, increased inflammatory symptoms, or worsening discomfort that seems almost impossible to explain. Foods naturally high in oxalates can include spinach, chocolate, coffee, beets, and many dark leafy greens that are otherwise considered healthy. And this is where nutrition becomes fascinating. A food can be nutritious and still not be ideal for a specific person at a specific time. If histamine reduction strategies haven't improved symptoms, evaluating oxalate-rich foods may sometimes become worth considering, especially if inflammation, digestive symptoms, or unexplained discomfort continue. But there's another category of food that may be doing something even more damaging to the brain, something millions of people consume every day without thinking twice. It's the category responsible for blood sugar spikes, inflammation, energy crashes, and long-term damage to blood vessels, including the tiny vessels your brain desperately depends on. In the next part, we'll talk about high glycemic foods, hidden sugar instability, and why what happens after you eat may be silently influencing your memory, focus, and future cognitive health. Now, let me ask you something important. Have you ever eaten a meal that made you feel amazing for a few minutes, only to leave you tired, unfocused, irritable, or strangely unmotivated shortly afterward? Maybe you blamed stress, poor sleep, or a busy day. But what if your food was quietly influencing your brain far more than you realized? Because one of the most underestimated threats to long-term cognitive health isn't just what you eat, it's how quickly what you eat changes your blood sugar. This brings us to high glycemic foods, one of the biggest hidden drivers of inflammation, blood vessel stress, energy crashes, and gradual brain aging. To understand why this matters, we first need to clear up one major misconception. Many people think all carbohydrates are automatically bad, or that protecting the brain means avoiding sugar completely. That simply isn't true. Your brain absolutely requires energy to function. In fact, despite making up only a tiny percentage of your body weight, the brain consumes a surprisingly large share of your body's fuel every day. You rely on glucose to think clearly, focus, process emotions, form memories, and make decisions. Without stable energy, the brain struggles. The real problem isn't glucose itself. The problem is instability. Your brain performs best when fuel arrives steadily and predictably. But modern diets often create the exact opposite environment. Instead of gradual energy delivery, many people repeatedly expose their brains to sharp spikes and sudden crashes in blood sugar. And every time that roller coaster happens, your body pays a price. This is where understanding glycemic index and glycemic load becomes incredibly valuable. Think of glycemic load as how much sugar a food contains overall. Glycemic index, on the other hand, reflects how quickly that sugar enters your bloodstream. Why does this matter? Because two foods may contain similar amounts of carbohydrates, but one may release energy slowly while another floods your bloodstream almost instantly. That rapid rise forces your body into a stressful metabolic response. Blood sugar spikes sharply, insulin reacts, and then often comes the crash. And your brain notices every step of it. At first, you may feel energized, alert, even mentally stimulated. But shortly after, many people experience the opposite effect: sluggishness, poor concentration, brain fog, fatigue, cravings, irritability, and a strange inability to focus. Sound familiar? That temporary mental crash isn't random. It reflects a biological shift happening inside your nervous system. Over years and decades, repeated blood sugar instability may contribute to inflammation and gradual damage to blood vessels throughout the body, including the tiny, delicate vessels supplying oxygen to your brain. When these vessels struggle, brain cells receive less of what they need to function efficiently. And remember something important: your brain is incredibly demanding. Even though it represents only a small fraction of your total body weight, it consumes an enormous amount of energy every day. Your brain is constantly working, whether you're thinking, sleeping, solving problems, remembering names, regulating emotions, or simply staying alive. That means stable fuel matters. This doesn't mean carbohydrates are evil. It doesn't mean everyone needs an extreme diet. And it definitely doesn't mean you must fear food. The goal is balance. Historically, humans evolved eating foods that released energy much more gradually than many modern processed foods do today. Compare naturally occurring carbohydrates to many ultra-processed products loaded with refined starches and sugars. The difference in blood sugar response can be dramatic. Instead of steady energy, highly processed foods often deliver quick stimulation followed by exhaustion. And here's what many people miss. Repeated glucose spikes don't only affect energy. They may influence inflammation, accelerate cellular aging, increase oxidative stress, and contribute to mechanisms associated with cognitive decline. Oxidative stress is especially important here. Think of oxidative stress as biological wear and tear happening inside your cells. Over time, this process contributes to aging throughout the body, including the brain. When blood sugar repeatedly spikes, oxidative stress tends to rise, placing additional pressure on neurons already vulnerable to inflammation and aging. This is why choosing slower digesting carbohydrate sources often matters more than simply counting carbs. Foods that release energy gradually can help create more stable glucose levels, reducing dramatic highs and lows. That stability may support better concentration, more consistent energy, improved mood, and potentially healthier brain function over time. But blood sugar isn't the only hidden danger sitting in modern diets. There's another category of ingredients quietly linked to inflammation, poor cognitive function, metabolic disease, and even structural changes in the brain itself. And chances are you've eaten them far more often than you think. I'm talking about trans fats. Now, not all fats are harmful. In fact, your brain relies heavily on healthy fats to function properly. But trans fats are different. While tiny natural amounts may exist in certain animal products, the overwhelming majority of trans fats come from industrial processing. These fats are commonly created through manufacturing methods that make oils more stable, cheaper, and longer lasting on store shelves. The problem is what happens once they enter the body. Trans fats are highly prone to oxidation, which means they can contribute significantly to inflammation and cellular stress. Research has repeatedly linked high intake of trans fats with poor cardiovascular health, diabetes risk, obesity, and even fertility problems. But what many people don't realize is how deeply these fats may affect the brain. Some research has associated higher trans fat consumption with poor cognitive performance and reduced memory function. In studies involving adults, people consuming greater amounts of trans fats often performed worse in memory-related tasks than those who avoided them. Imagine spending years trying to sharpen your focus, improve your memory, or stay mentally sharp while unknowingly feeding your brain substances that may work against those goals. And unfortunately, the story doesn't stop there. Because right after people begin understanding the dangers of sugar, many make what seems like a logical switch. They stop consuming regular sugar and turn instead to artificial sweeteners, believing they've found the healthier solution. But what if that solution isn't as harmless as it seems? In the next part, we'll uncover the truth about artificial sweeteners, hidden neurotoxins, gluten, sodium imbalance, and several surprising foods that may quietly interfere with brain health in ways most people never expect. At this point, you might be thinking, fine, I'll just avoid sugar and switch to diet products instead. And honestly, that seems like a reasonable decision. After all, if blood sugar spikes can stress the brain, wouldn't replacing sugar with artificial sweeteners automatically be better? This is exactly where things become more complicated than most people expect. Artificial sweeteners were originally marketed as the perfect solution. Sweet taste, fewer calories, little or no blood sugar spike. On paper, it sounds ideal, but your brain and nervous system don't always respond to food the way marketing suggests. Some artificial sweeteners have raised concerns over the years because of their potential neurological and metabolic effects. While research remains complex and sometimes controversial, smaller studies and experimental findings have suggested possible links between certain artificial sweeteners and problems involving metabolism, weight regulation, and even changes affecting the nervous system. What makes this especially interesting is that your brain responds not only to nutrients, but also to expectations. When you taste sweetness, your body prepares for energy. Hormones shift. Metabolism anticipates fuel. But when sweetness arrives without the expected nutritional response, some researchers believe this mismatch may influence appetite regulation, cravings, and metabolic signaling in ways we still don't fully understand. That doesn't mean every sugar substitute is automatically dangerous, but it does mean they may not be the harmless shortcut many people assume. Among the available alternatives, stevia is often considered one of the less problematic options. However, even here, details matter. There is a difference between minimally processed stevia and heavily refined extracts found inside highly processed products. Another option that has gained attention is monk fruit extract, which appears to have fewer neurological concerns compared to some artificial alternatives. But even with these options, moderation remains important. The bigger message here isn't fear, it's awareness. Many people spend years focusing only on calories while completely overlooking inflammation, metabolic stress, and how food influences cognitive function over time. And surprisingly, some of the biggest hidden brain stressors may not even taste sweet. Let's talk about sodium. For years, sodium has been treated like the villain of nutrition, but the truth is more nuanced than that. Your body actually needs sodium to function. Your nerves rely on it, your muscles rely on it, your brain relies on electrical signaling that depends heavily on mineral balance. The problem is in balance. Modern diets often contain extremely high sodium levels while remaining surprisingly low in potassium and magnesium minerals that help regulate healthy nerve signaling, blood pressure, and proper cellular communication. Think about your brain like an electrical network. Neurons communicate through tiny electrical signals every second of the day. When mineral balance becomes disrupted, those signals may become less efficient.